Hello, I'm Dr. Mikey Mewborn, and this is Systematic Theology 1. Today we're looking at the existence of God. What a great topic to discuss. Sometimes it's very difficult to explain our beliefs on this or to really understand how to approach the subject when you're in a conversation with someone. I've had many witnessing opportunities where I've shared my faith with somebody, and then they might look at me halfway through and they say, I don't believe that God exists. How can you prove that to me? Can you prove to me that somebody exists that I can't see or I can't touch? And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to break down some of the ways of doing that, teaching somebody what you believe. What does the Bible have to say about this subject? And how can we know that God exists? So that's what we're going to do today. So I am so glad to be with you today. I hope you enjoy this study. God bless you. Bye-bye. Hello and welcome to Systematic Theology 1. Today we're looking at the existence of God. Good to be with you. Let's go ahead and jump into our study. I want to begin by looking at the existence of God from Millard Erickson. He begins by telling us a few strong statements. Number one, God exists. This point is assumed as a first truth or established by an empirical proof. So that's very important. Number two, God has specially revealed himself in the Bible. So God has made himself known. First, he exists. Then second, he is specially revealed himself. And then third, the special revelation must be investigated in order to determine what God has revealed. Now, if we look at Romans chapter 1, verse 20, we see this displayed. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. In other words, God has revealed himself. He has made himself known through creation. And because of that, people are without excuse. So that's very important when we're thinking about who God is, his existence. He's made himself known. He's revealed himself, and we'll see more about that a little bit later on. I want to start with Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225, lived to 1274. Here's a picture of him here. But why is he so significant? He's significant for many reasons. Number one, he had a great mind, a true philosopher, a true intelligent person that could understand the deep theologies as well as philosophies in the world. He was an Italian Dominican friar. He was a Catholic priest. He's a philosopher as well as a theologian. So his mind, he was also called a doctor of the church. He was known as being a person who truly knew the Word of God forward and backward, if you want to say it that way. And Millard Erickson speaks of him and says this. It says, Thomas Aquinas maintained that the existence of God could be proved by pure reason without relying on any external authority. I think that's interesting. I had to do when I was in college, I had to do I guess it was a short speech or something for public speaking, and I was asked to speak on a subject that was focusing on evolution or debunking evolution. And I asked the teacher if this would be okay if I did this, and he said, you can do that, but you cannot use the Bible. We cannot focus in. He said you can only do it by words of reason or by facts, dealing with reasonable facts, I guess you would say. And so that was my focus, and I had to do that just in a certain kind of way. Well, what Thomas Aquinas is saying here is that he can prove the existence of God just by pure reasoning with people, or pure reason. So let's look at some of those things about him. The first argument he makes is the argument from motion. Our senses can perceive motion by seeing that things act on one another, how things move around. So whatever moves is moved by something else. Consequently, there must be a first mover that can create this chain of reaction of motions. So this is the idea that God is causing these things to be in motion. So that's important when you think about that. And then you move on. The next one is the argument from efficient causes. Because nothing can cause itself, everything must have a cause or something that creates an effect on another thing. Without first cause, there'd be no others. Therefore, the first cause is God. Number three, the argument from possibility and necessity. What this is speaking about, or what this is about, is because objects in the world come into existence and pass out of it, it is possible for those objects to exist or not exist at any particular time. However, nothing can come from nothing. This means something must exist at all times. This is an argument for God. Number four, argument from gradation of being. There are different degrees of goodness in different things, following the great chain of being, which states there is a gradual increase in complexity. Created objects move from unformed inorganic matter to biologically complex organisms. Therefore, there must be a being of highest form of good. This perfect being, of course, we would say is God. Number five is the argument from design. Now, when we think about the argument from design, we're going to see that all things have an order or arrangement that leads them to a particular goal. Because the order of the universe cannot be the result of chance, design and purpose must be at work. This implies divine intelligence on the part of the designer. This is God. I know that's a lot to swallow, that's a lot to take in, but these arguments were Thomas Aquinas's reasons why there's a God. And so he is saying just on these alone, we can explain or actually prove that God does exist. And I think that's kind of neat when you look at all those kinds of things. Now, the next one we're going to look at is Wayne Grudem's perspective on the existence of God and his thoughts on this. And he says that there are four main ways of arguing this point, these arguments: cosmological, teleological, ontological, and moral argument. These arguments are very strong. So the cosmological argument considers that facts that every known thing in the universe has a cause. Everything has a cause. The teleological argument, telos means end, goal, or purpose, focuses on the evidence of harmony, order, and design in the universe and argues that its design gives evidence of an intelligent purpose. The ontological argument begins with the idea of God, who is defined a being greater than which nothing can be imagined. In other words, this is saying the being that God really is more than we could ever imagine. And so if you can imagine something that's greater than anything you could ever imagine, then he must truly exist. And then also the moral argument begins from man's sense of right and wrong and of the need for justice to be done, and argues that there must be a God who is the source of right and wrong and who will someday mete out justice to all people. So these are the arguments that Wayne Grudem brings forth to us. A quote I wanted to bring to your attention is by Richard Hooker, who was an English priest and of the Church of England, influential theologian, all those types of things, and lived during the 16th century. He said, "Of law there can be no less acknowledged than that her seat is the bosom of God, her voice the harmony of the world. All things in heaven and earth do her homage, and are the very least as feeling her care, and the greatest as not exempted from her power." It's talking about the law that God puts in place that actually oversees everything. So if you want to talk about the law of God in itself, maybe you want to talk about the Ten Commandments. That's what governs the world in a sense, but also the laws that God puts in place that govern everything. So God reigns supremely over everything, and it's his law that is just above everything, and so that brings forth harmony, and it speaks forth of who he is. It reveals the greatness of God, so God revealing himself in many different ways. One of my favorite people to maybe watch a YouTube of, or to read his books, or to go to a conference that he speaks at, is Ravi Zacharias. Here's a picture of him. And he speaks a lot about the existence of God. Now, he goes from college campus to college campus, or maybe to a church, and sometimes he'll debate people. Sometimes he just debates with people that come up and ask questions out of the audience. And that's probably one of his favorite forms of debate, is someone steps up from their seat, comes to the microphone and asks him a question. Maybe they want to contest him on something, whatever it might be, and he will answer them. one of the great questions that he loves to answer is, how can you explain the existence of God? Can the existence of God really be proven? And so his argument is similar to what I'll give you here. Does evil exist? That's a question that he would ask. Do you believe evil exists in the world? And a lot of times people would quickly say, absolutely. People are evil. People do bad things. Murderers, rapists, child molesters, people that are out there doing harm to other people. Yes, there's evil in the world. Thieves taking things from people, taking their livelihood away from them, taking everything. He said, does evil exist? And the answer is yes. Then there must be a measurable form of good. That would be his response. Well, if you say that evil exists, well, then you'd also have to say that there must be good in the world, because you'd have to have something to measure it by. And so he would say, well, if you believe evil exists, then you must believe in a certain form of good. And if good exists, then there must be a moral law. If a moral law exists, there must be a moral law giver. The moral law giver is none other than God himself. And this is a logical flow that Ravi Zacharias would use to explain to somebody that God truly does exist. He has to. You say, well, that seems very simple. It is very simple. But throughout the arguments you'll see by people like Thomas Aquinas, Wayne Grudem, Millard Erickson, so many in the world, the Josh McDowells, whoever you talk about, these guys are going to use these types of proofs when speaking about the Bible. So the question, does God exist? We would say yes, absolutely. Let me give you 5 C's of God's existence, and these kind of will help you when sharing your faith with somebody, or possibly if you're in a conversation and you're somebody that you're talking to just doesn't see or doesn't understand. And these 5 C's, I've used these several times when trying to explain the gospel to somebody or who God is. Number 1, I start with creation. In Romans chapter 1, it talks about God's invisible attributes have been made known by what he's created. And because of that creation, that all men are without excuse. And so creation speaks of God's glory. The heavens declare his glory. Number 2, conscience. Romans 2 speaks of this. There's a conscience that people have, and that conscience, he talked about the Gentiles, it's written on their hearts, it's written on them. They know the difference from within inside, that there's something wrong about what they're doing, and it's kind of already there. And you say, well, how do you know that? It's interesting. Even when you look in the Old Testament and you look before the time that the law was given, people already knew that certain things were wrong. Cain knew it was wrong to kill Abel. God actually made it known to him. Do not go down this road. Evil is crouching at the door. Don't go down this road. That's wrong. Actually, we see later on Joseph, he doesn't want to commit adultery. Why? Because he knows that's wrong. You say, why? Because there's a moral law, moral standard that God has put in place, and even in the conscience. Christ. In John chapter 1, we know this, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Well, when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, it was God showing himself. Jesus truly is, as the book of Colossians says, he is the image of the invisible God. He is making God clearly evident in the flesh. And so that's what's happening there. So you got creation, conscience, Christ. I love to say canon for the next one. We know canon, that's how we refer to the inspired word of God sometimes. And it means it's the measuring rod, the measuring stick. It's what's been given to us. And what we see in John chapter 20 is that these things were written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is the Savior of the world. And that's what that speaks of in John chapter 20. And then number 5, I call that one compassion. The whole idea of love is so foreign to atheism. It doesn't make any sense. No one understands it. It doesn't make any sense in the animal kingdom. And so the idea that humans love one another and show compassion for one another is very, very unique. In John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. You see in 1 John chapters 3 and 4, you see very similar things, but in 1 John 3:16 says, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. And it talks about later on in chapter 4, God is love. Well, what that's saying is that if we want to know what true love is, it's going to come from God. And the truest form of love is that Jesus Christ laid down his life for sinners. And so we see through that is an act of compassion, an act of true sacrifice, a true act of love. And that's a picture of the existence of God. So I think those 5 C's are very helpful. They've helped me throughout ministry to share with somebody that God really does exist and he really does love you. As we continue on, I want you to see this, what we're referring to in Romans chapter 2 with conscience. Look at this in verses 14 and 15. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Look what it says there that's underlined and in red. While their conscience also bears witness. You see, they know. The Gentiles he's speaking of here, they know. Even though they don't have the oracles of God given to them personally like the Jews did, they knew that there was something off. And so that's important when you think about that. As we continue on, the existence of God is clearly seen in some verses. Psalm 14:1, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Psalm 53:1, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. It's foolish to say that at all. In Romans 1:24 and 25, therefore God gave them up to the lust of their heart, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. All right. Great passage here, Psalm 19:1 and 2. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. Speaking of God, you just see his revelation through in many different ways. In the existence of God, I think Christians, of course, we would say, have a clear and growing understanding of the existence and presence of God. That's obviously true. We see it in Romans chapter 8, verses 15 and 16. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. So God's Spirit bears witness with us, lets us know, reveals to us that we are the children of God. It's powerful. In 1 Peter 1:8, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. Why do you rejoice with joy? Because the joy of the Lord is within you, giving you the strength, because he has changed you from the inside out. I wanted to bring up this passage, and I thought this was interesting because we're talking about Christians, and the Galatians were, it was a group of believers that were in Galatia. And I think this is interesting because in Galatians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, look what the Apostle Paul writes to the church. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Let me ask you only this. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish, having begun by the Spirit? Are you now being perfected by the flesh? I want you to pay attention to this word foolish, the word that's there underlined in red. Foolish simply means non-thinking. You non-thinking people. What does that mean? It's almost the idea of non-believing people. You have this information, but you have discarded it from your mind for this time so that you can do whatever you want. And so what they did was they took out the element of how the Spirit of God works in people's lives. They took it out and they started trying to live by the flesh. Some people were even listening to people like the Judaizers who were saying, hey, if you really want to be saved, you have to be circumcised. And those types of things were completely off base with for the Galatians, of course, and for anybody, that you don't do anything in that way to be saved. We call upon the name of the Lord and we are saved. And so he says, you non-thinkers. It's almost as far as saying this, you agnostic people, why have you gone down this road? You non-thinking people or non-believing people, even though they're Christians, he said, you have changed your mind. You're thinking the wrong way about this. And then he says, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? He said, you're foolish. You began with the Spirit in salvation. Now are you being perfected by the flesh? Absolutely not. You should live by the Spirit every single day. I think that's an incredible rebuke for people who started out a certain way of believing truly in all the power of God, and then they became non-thinkers later on. I think that's important for us as we look at the existence of God, even within the camp of Christianity and within the individual soul believer. Okay? Good to be with you today. This has been Systematic Theology 1, The Existence of God. We'll talk to you soon. Bless you. Bye-bye. All right, I hope you enjoyed our study today on the existence of God. I know it's an intense subject. I also know it's a very vast subject. There's a lot to it. But through your reading and maybe through some outside resources, you can put together a great framework for your understanding of knowing what you're going to say the next time somebody comes to you and asks you, how do you prove that God exists? And so hopefully this has helped you out. But anyway, it's good to be with you today. Hope you have a great rest of the day. God bless you. Bye-bye.